Hi, friends, welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View. And today we have with us a very, very special guest, Mr. Rajan Singh Nazran from UK. Rajan, thank you so much for taking time out from a busy schedule and thank you for being on the show. Welcome.
No, you're more than welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be side by side with you again. I think more so for me, it's being interviewed by such a long-term journalist like yourself. So you got more decades of experience out there than most of the people that I know. So no, it's an absolute pleasure on my side.
So let me introduce Rajan Singh Nazran to our viewers. So it's a brief introduction. We will be giving the details in the description box. We'll also be sharing the relevant links through which you can know more about his work. So Rajan runs a very interesting platform. He's founded a very interesting platform called Global Indian Network. And then earlier there used to be a Global Indian series also. Probably both these coexist now. So this Global Indian Network is a unique platform which basically focuses to a large extent on Indian diaspora also. But Rajan himself has been a journalist. He has been basically a podcaster, and he has the most important thing is that he doesn't sit in a 4x4 cubicle and pontificate. He travels extensively. Last we had discussed, I think he has traveled more than 75 countries and he has interviewed dozens of heads of the uh, nation states and also leading voices from various walks of life. So it's a privilege and honor to have Rajan on our show, and today we are going to get involved in a very engaging conversation with Rajan on Indian diaspora, perceptions about Indian diaspora. But first, let's start with Rajan and his work. So, Rajan, how did this idea come to you? And tell us and tell our viewers more about the Global Indian Network and the Global Indian series.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that introduction. I suppose, like every good idea out there, everything's born by frustration, isn't it, Adam? So you have an idea based upon what real world experiences that you have. So a bit of a background on my side. My father was born in Punjab, India. My mother was born in the Philippines in Cagayan. So Indian origin, but born on the island side and there. And I was born in the UK. So I suppose before my entry into the world, I was already destined to be a global Indianist, so to speak. What I used to do is I used to work in the media and I used to work with some of the big brands in the UK establishment, like the Daily Telegraph, so on and so forth. And every time that I traveled, I came across people that looked like me, people of Indian origin, whether it was at university in Italy or it's in far distant lands all over. And the more you meet the community, the more you realize that we're very similar, but we're very different, the way that we view the world point. The biggest aha moment for me came because I was a friend to many heads of states. And I did a project in India at the time. It was at the Commonwealth Games, and I had met with the relevant ministers at that moment. And I realized that there was a massive discrepancy between the way that India viewed our community and how our community viewed India, and more importantly, how we all viewed each other, not through flags, but through these people-people relations. And undoubtedly, as a community, we've done incredibly well. So in many of the countries I've been to, you had people who became ministers through our type of ethno system, people that have done incredibly well in business, people that were social change makers, but their voices were not recognized. In those markets, what was really apparent was that there was underserved because you had these cultural centers, you had some local media, but nothing that really felt like it belonged to us. And then if you zoomed out amongst these locations, whether you're in Malawi or you're in Malaysia, a lot of these communities didn't know each other. So my question came up that I posed somebody, and that's what gave birth to us was, well, India means something to you. For most people, yes, it does. But do we mean anything to it? And then the further question was, well, do we mean anything to each other? As a civilization, as a community, not belonging to a flag, not belonging to a nation, but as this vast community that's gone around the world. And the simple answer to that was we don't know enough about each other to make meaningful contributions. And that's where the Global Indian Network kicked off. To say, well, why don't we becoming mooring ground for this vast community that has been massively underserved, that doesn't really have a voice on the international stage in the way that we deserve to. How do we also become a mooring ground to bring those ideas together, open conversation without fear or favor, to talk about the big challenges that we have in the countries that we call home? For example, the communities facing issues such as far right nationalism in countries like the UK or even in countries in South Africa. And then how do we collectively then have a mutual understanding of our value chain globally? And that's what we kicked off. We started doing podcasts with the people that I met along my travels, heads of states, ministers, CEOs. And then we went into long form journalism. And then we started to enter into the media world by having this information out there. But the main priority as a network is to operate without fear or favor and to provide a mooring ground of open, sound conversations that reflect on who we are and where we're heading to together. And purposefully, it's called the Global Indian Network because this means now is all of us. It's not just looking from an India-centric viewpoint, but it's from us collectively looking towards each other and saying, how do we make this world work? So in short, frustration, and that frustration turned into, well, why don't we do something about it? So I thought I'm also put my travel and my experience to good use and therefore make a difference in the world at large.
So, Rajan, so when we talk about the Indian diaspora today, so it feels very different from even a decade ago. And
Yeah.
in your view, how is the diaspora redefining itself in terms of identity, influence, and confidence?
Really good question, Arun, which is something that I wouldn't always expect from yourself. So you're peeling back the onion layer. I'm going to kick it off with how do we see ourselves? Last 10 years has been a pivotal change for the community. Now, I'm going to parenthesize this quite quickly. You know, we're the world's largest community by numbers. We know that for a fact. And we've done well economically, we've done well financially, and well politically as well. But we've never been connected before. So a lot of these stories were isolated. Now, because I've traveled to these markets, I have a deeper understanding compared to most of the people out there because I know the social structures in those nations. I know what we've been through. I know the stories, and we've got the audiences there. So everything I say here is based upon those exposure and those experiences. 10, 15 years back, I think the best way to have seen it is if you had gone to a cricket match in the UK, or if you went to a cricket match in South Africa or in the Caribbean, and India were to ever play, well, you know, regardless of where we're born, we will be holding the Indian flags. Why? Because it was people that looked like us that were treated with a sense of respect. And so much of it was nostalgia, but the other part is a psychological relevance. We felt that we belonged. Fast forward to where we are now, we play anchoring roles within the nations that we call home. Therefore, our ideas are no longer based on multiculturalism, i.e., we have the culture of India through our parents or even first generation, and we hold on to that. Now is pluralism. We belong to the nations, and we feel that we also define the nations that we live in. So, therefore, our confidence in our identity is far more greater than it was 10 years ago because the world has changed significantly. And I think that makes a slight shift because before everything was India centric, that was a motherland, that was the ideas that shaped our very being, our identity. Now it's just another aspect to our understanding of the world. Because for the first time ever, we realize that the person like Arun is sitting there in Delhi, I'm sitting right now in London, but we got counterparts sitting in Guatemala. I was in Uruguay recently. There's a huge Indian community in Uruguay. We got counterparts sitting all the way in Zimbabwe, in Harare. And for the first time ever, our perspective of this Indianness is global. So now it's no longer held by India as just a geographical nation, but it's held by all of us. And now we're re-identifying what that identity means. That's a huge shift. That has a big impact in our confidence in ourselves. It has a big impact in how we look at each other. It has an impact in the way that we look at India. And more importantly, is a life lesson for modern day India to understand that actually this is a community that is far more sophisticated than ever before. And whereby we know how the world works, it could be an added advantage, But now, for the first time ever, it's a two-way conversation, not a one-way conversation. We're strong and secure in who we are. It also means there's a big difference in the way that we look at the soft power as well as economic diplomacy as well.
Uh, no, you talked about, and we have earlier had conversation also. So, how do you look at, India's engagement with its diaspora? So, has it also evolved, or is it still stuck in that, time frame? And is it merely, cultural connection, or is it something more strategic, which India is doing? Is it only, the common cultural connect, or is it something more strategic? And do you see this? If this has happened, so do you see any structural shift in how India views the Indian diaspora or its own global community?
I think there has been a change. There's always been a reach out from India's point of view to utilize the NRIs at one point, whether it's the non-required Indian or the National Reserve of India. I don't know which one. It's up to you to debate that. There's always been an attempt of India because they've realized this is a big community that spends billions back home to India through remittances. So there's that wave. Then there was the whole intellectual capacity part of the diaspora. Silicon Valley, the Indians in politics, and India wanted to utilize that, which it should do, in all honesty, as people to people relations, to see if it can get a step forward, especially when it comes to agreements and seeing how they can progress. I think a lot of it still is stuck in two parts. I think a lot of it hasn't evolved much from just the cultural relevance because culture in itself, Adam, is constantly shifting and adapting. So therefore, what is culturally relevant to you in India will be very different from the identifiables for us in the markets that we call home. For example, a Hindu in Suriname will be very different from a Hindu sitting in Mauritius. Both people may be brown on the outside, may still practice a form of Hinduism, but a different practice that is more localized than ever. And that's just the way that religion works. Likewise, a Sikh in both nations or a Muslim in both nations. So I think a lot of it still, in my mind, has been stuck on the cultural relevance, which I get because there's a common denominator of influence. There certainly is a shift in terms of the strategic level that I've seen in the last 7 years or so, where there's been an attempt out there to utilize the diplomatic centers of India in a way to be able to incorporate itself within that diasporic politics to get hold of the dividends. I'm going to say something controversial, but I'd rather be honest, open, and frank. Do I think it's been enough? Absolutely not. I think it's only touched the tipping parts of the iceberg. And I think the reason why is because if I speak about it from the outside in, I think what India has not fully been able to do is have the right partners in those countries that provide them with not only access, but more importantly, knowledge and intel, cultural competence, those softer parts that equate to how do you really get the movement happening. I think that's been a big lacking skill. I think the other part is that because there's been this big over reliance on the cultural aspect, you've forgotten that there's a lot more other layers at play here that could actually unleash economic potential for both partners. So I think there has been a direction, there has been a shift. I don't think it's been utilized enough. I see that there's a plan there. Maybe the execution of the plan hasn't been the way that India may have wanted, and purely that could be a capacity thing either for ambassadors that are there. It could be maybe civil servants from the Indian side. There could be a variety of different things. But I do feel there's a shift. I'm going to take the question a bit further, if I may have your agreement.
Yes,
So I'm
yes,
going to take
please go ahead.
yeah. What I have seen is another big shift. It's the role in which markets view India to be. And that has a big impact about how the diaspora community see themselves and their connection to India. I'll give you an example. So we often work, a lot of people know that we work with big Indian media platforms as well, like newspaper outlets and so forth. When I work with other medias in different countries, the amount of support we get from those embassies is huge because they realize that this is soft economic diplomacy. This gives them the public diplomacy and economic diplomacy. It gets people aware about the opportunity of India Inc., i.e., India potential, and also it gets some awareness that overcomes the many misperceptions that people have of present day India, especially because of the way that the media pushes a story. Now, with other media houses, embassies always give work. They always help out, they support because they realize that. With Indian embassies, unfortunately, the amount of bureaucracy there is unbelievable. And because there is this bottleneck there, I think that is actually ruining a lot of the opportunities for India moving forward. They're now not utilizing a new system of thinking that the diaspora feel, but also how those markets view a nation to be. That, mark my words, if it's not corrected in the next 5 years, will be a ticking time bomb for a nation like India. Obviously, I'm a British national, so I'm going to be taking Britain first approach at this nation point. But you kind of think is the most common sense topic that you can think of. It's something that has immediate results, immediate return in terms of how you can bring a diaspora closer to you, but it's something that just hasn't really been utilized. There's a danger right there.
So, Rajan, no, there is a very interesting dichotomy, or I would say a paradox, which we are witnessing, especially while sitting in India. So, on one hand, every year we are getting the list of, especially not only the high net worth individuals, but a large number of Indians moving out of India and settling especially in the Western nations, Europe and US. So, and on the other hand, there is also a lot of chatter now about the brain gain instead of brain drain, what we used to call, or even there is this term called brain circulation. So,
Yeah.
so how do you see this paradox, and how do you see this paradox playing out in real terms between India and the overseas Indians?
Um, I'm going to get rid of the word overseas Indian. I'm going to intentionally say global Indian
Yeah, global
because
Indians. I
we're,
stand
we're global.
corrected. Thank you.
Yeah, so we're globally minded.
Yeah.
Um, Look, I believe in the circular economy. I think that we have to think bigger and larger, that this is a civilizational issue at this moment in time. It's the first time ever, Arun, that we have a community as large as this in present day history that is geographically dispersed in more numbers than most people realize, that has got an economic powerhouse, a political wealth behind it, but more importantly, has a natural affinity for one another. So that has never happened before in any other civilization on this earth. And that's purely down to logistics, travel, and also look at the colonial history as well. Now, if we look at that structure in itself, we can only then admire the fact that everything that's happening from India and from our point of view as a global Indian community will become circular in nature. Because this isn't no longer about India, it's no longer about Britain or the US, Canada, anything else. This is about us as a community. And so, therefore, that guy that's sitting in Singapore right now, who's of Indian origin, who's raising investments from possibly the US, Silicon Valley, who's then going to be reinvesting in Bangalore, who then has a product that they sell within Nigeria, who then finds an opportunity in the Solomon Islands. Well, it's only going to be circular. We see financial circularity when it comes to income. We see a mental circularity in terms of the way in which we now look to do business. We've taken this onto a global stage. This is no longer about a geographical nation of India. This is about this incredible architecture around the world, a tapestry that goes beyond any of the communities out there. And I say that robustly with my hand on my heart. We've done exceedingly well. So therefore, India will never have a brain drain, and neither would the UK if we had the UK-India trade agreement. What we do, if we look from a larger image coming down, is that it will be a circular movement that goes beyond any nation's proximity, but more importantly, their ideas. What we need to capture on is ensuring that we have a network vast enough, but more important, open minded enough to realize actually there's a place for everyone to be part of this. Because if we all collectively work together, it's in the benefit of everyone else as well. So I don't agree with brain drain. That's out of my equation. It's a constant flow, and it will always be that way.
Yeah. So, before I go on to the last question, I just want to slip in another question, like you mentioned about the way Indian embassies or the Indian Foreign Service in, other countries work and your experience also. So, if what can India, probably, if we look at, because we very closely look, China is also, big civilization, and China is also the arch rival. Uh, you know, many consider it to be arch rival, many consider it to be far ahead of India. So, but in this part of the world, so China is something basically, India is no more hyphenated with Pakistan, but probably hyphenated more with China.
Yeah.
So, how does, because China also has a huge diaspora. And
Yeah.
so, how does for our viewers, especially, not only domestic viewers but in other parts of the world also. So, how does the China is leveraging its diaspora? Can India, it's always good to learn from others. Of course, other countries are doing it, but in terms of size and scale, I think Chinese diaspora is something which is also pretty well dispersed
Yeah.
and which is quite huge and growing by numbers. So how do you see is there some lesson in India for it?
I think India's got many lessons to learn from China, but also from other nations around the world. But I do believe India's got something that China doesn't have, is the fact that because of the historical mapping of what happened with Britain, and if you have a look at things like indentureship and also the trading routes, we get an advantage over China in a big way, whereby a lot of the communities are 8 generations deep within certain markets. So whereas China's incarnation across the globe is rather more recent, ours is far more deeper and layered. South Africa is a classic example. Fiji is another example. So our challenge is slightly unique. We need to re-engage a community that felt that they was almost lost from outside of India, who have now built up their own identity and their identifiables. And having a waving flag ceremony or respectfully doing a yoga day doesn't really cut the mustard because it doesn't bother, it doesn't come in the type of mindset of that community. They'll join in, they'll do it on a superficial level, but really internally, it's just a little dressing gown that they're going to switch off afterwards. So I think that's something that we need to address, but we'll go into that later. The China coincidence is slightly different because they've really utilized economic diplomacy to another level. I'll give you an example. I worked in Ethiopia. I worked alongside Meles Zenawi at the time, who was the prime minister, president, long-running head of state within the region. And when I was in Addis, you could see China's influence with the African Union. So not just Ethiopia, but as a continent player. And they set up things like the CAD Fund, the China Africa Development Fund, and so they backed it up with financial incentives as well. Then you go into markets like Guyana, where you had the Chinese community there because of the Brits for the tin mining. And so you can see the influence of China within these communities because one, they utilized the cultural relevance, but they also had a linguistic relevance that a lot of India has not really, in my opinion, not really thought through. Because the language that India is now being portraying out there has been Hindi, whereby in some of these communities, Adan, if I were to say that Bhojpuri is still kind of spoken, whether through chutney music or so on and so forth, many people in India would be thinking, what on earth is that? Whereby for these guys, this is a sense of Indianness, this is a sense of identity that goes beyond the nation of India, but to a very pinpoint geographical location where they can say, that is mine. And so there's these little type of isms. So I think what China's done expertly well is that they utilize economic diplomacy. They've utilized the linguistics of either Cantonese or Mandarin, so only two type of variables. Also, importantly, they've invested into businesses there that enable their communities to grow. So not just their own that come over through maybe some type of bilaterals, but also going out there. And that is all over the globe, whether you're in Nigeria, again, if you're in Suriname, you can see the Chinese communities there, or even in Sierra Leone, when I was there during the Ebola crisis, the communities are there and they're strong. India's advantage is that we've been in the across the globe for a lot longer than most other nations out there. We're a lot deeper and more entrenched within these nations. And we have a natural familiarity with one another. I think what we have to do is intellectually now reconsider how the approach comes in. For so long, India had the approach. For so long, there was two different approaches. At one stage, when modern India wasn't the powerhouse that it was this approach. You're the diaspora. You went across the waters. You were the wealthy cousin. You look at India, and India's type of rupee rate was here. It was unbalanced. Then India started to shift. And then in the emerging markets, India started doing this. So they started looking down to the compartments in Fiji or in Trinidad and these other markets. Now, what we've seen with the Global Indian Network, what we've done is squarely done this. And if you have a negotiation, if you have a relationship that you see eye to eye, there's a lot more opportunities that are presented. So, in all, I think India can learn from a lot of different communities out there. I don't think it's fair when the world tries to pit India and Pakistan against each other. Economically, it doesn't make a fair equation. It's not fair for Pakistan because it's almost Mike Tyson against an amateur boxer. Respectfully so, not saying out of politics, but pure economics. Also, I don't think it's fair because it brings into question a religious point of view, which people often try and use against India. What they don't realize is that there's more Muslims in India than there are in Pakistan, But again, common sense is everything but common, right? I do think India now at the present stage can compete in the international markets, but I think they need to do a lot more when it comes to public diplomacy, a lot more when it comes to economic diplomacy, and they have to realize that the world around them has changed significantly, and there's a lot of data, a lot of know-how that present day India is missing out on. And likewise, as a global Indian community, we are now learning that India is only one of our partners out there for global success. Could India benefit by being the partner? Absolutely. But then India has to also come to the drawing board with us as a partner in progress rather than being someone that's trying to anchoring in the back ends of things.
So, now coming to the end of this podcast. So looking ahead, let's talk a little bit more about, Global Indian Network. So looking ahead, what has been your experience that uh, platforms like Global Indian Network, so can they go beyond, networking to actually start shaping the policy conversations, innovation ecosystems, or even if I, extend it a little bit, India's global narrative? Because India's global narrative seems to be missing. Let's basically accept this. So that's my personal viewpoint that India's global narrative is somehow, missing. So how do you see basically, global Indian, what has been your experience in terms of, influencing the policy conversations and the global
Yeah.
narratives? So, then probably, people who want to work in the same kind of domain, they can benefit, from your experience also, and also what India needs to do to ensure that the potential of platforms like Global Indian Network, so they are realized fully to the advantage of India.
Yeah, is a good question. So in terms of policies, what have we been actively been able to activate? Good question. So we've been able to do a lot of things, and this is the surprising thing. I set up the network with everything from a hope dream and thinking this is a civilizational question. I've been able to grow the network, so we're now in over 49 countries with the podcast platform. We have heads of states, over 22 heads of states that receive our content briefings every week, over 350 ministers, ultra high net worth individuals globally. We have a Rolodex that goes deeper than even most other business councils in India. And more importantly, we got trust. People trust us. That's why we'll be able to host the conversations that we do. We also set up our own ambassadors program, and that came because of a conversation I had in another country with an Indian ambassador where I thought, well, things have to change. If these guys aren't going to help us, well, then we'll set up our own. And so if you look at our ambassadors program, we have former heads of state that work with us. We got current ministers, we got members of the royal household, as well as members of the House of Lords. And this goes right the way across the globe. So it shows it's possible and it can be achieved. Policies. What we did, we instituted a few couple of things. So one, we supported one of the women that has been with us, Nala Amin, to help change the legislations, to give her the support, change the legislations in New York over child marriage laws. Over 50 million kids every single year get married off under loopholes. Many of these kids are under the age of 18. Many of them do not see their 18th birthday. This is a big issue. So now there was a law that was instituted within the US called the Nala Amin law that now means, regardless of your religious identity, you're not getting married until the age of 18. Now, that is a big difference because it means there's protection of people and young kids. So that's one thing on that side. Second part, when a couple of years ago, unfortunately, there was a huge movement in South Africa and there was bullets in the ground, and there was this big chanting of one bullet, one Indian. Not an Indian national, but Indian. We're all classed the same type of thing, no matter where you go in the world, Aaron. And so what we did is that we challenged it head on. We went out to business owners that we did, and we said, let's practice economic diplomacy. Write me a letter that clearly states until you see the change in South Africa, you refuse to put money within the system. And then we approached governments. So we got members of the House of Lords to make statements about it. We got now the current president of Trinidad and Tobago to write a letter for this. And we lobbied aggressively across the globe. We also approached the Indian government saying your standing point here is important. Because if you want to be a voice for a community, you need to be there for the community at these most important moments. So you have to put aside your typical diplomacy and work with the people to people relations. Every other country did support us. That brought a policy directly to South Africa saying, here we stand as a community. So regardless, if you trying to raise finance, whether from the likes of Guyana or you try and raise finance from any of the nations, now know what you're doing to our community will echo right the way across the sphere. We're networked together, we're communicated together, therefore we can now practice our own form of economic diplomacy. It's a way of putting sanctions inadvertently towards someone. So that's another thing that we've been able to do. For India's viewpoint, India's actually benefited a lot inadvertently from our work, because when we did our pieces on Malta and Portugal, we'll go out there and talk about India Inc. and how large it is and what's currently taking place and why people need to be part of the platform to reach the audiences. I dare say we did a lot more in Malta than even your embassies could have ever achieved. And in Portugal, we had very strong support there from the ambassador at the time, which was Nandini, was an amazing human being who saw the vision and actually supported us to going out there, and that benefited the Portuguese-India relationships. So there's a lot of things that we've done there that actually changes the lever. So it's not rhetoric, it's real movement. Also internationally, in a lot of the markets, like the Caribbean, a lot of the Caribbean heads of states now realize the opportunity of the global Indian community. Inadvertently, then they understand the opportunity of India. You would have seen my interview with President Museveni from Uganda. It got over 1 million views. Again, talking about the Indian consciousness, but more importantly, about some of the misperceptions that people have. So that's what we've been able to institute, and it's a growing movement. In terms of innovation, is a good question. Look, I think on the innovation front, we've been having a look and having serious conversations on taking ourselves to the next incarnation as a network. Rather than just being a mooring ground for open conversation, is saying, well, how do we become an institution of our own right? A bit like the Commonwealth, but this time the common brand wealth for all of us, whereby we have different institutions that can work alongside us. This opens up the sphere then for investments, to have a relook at how can we invest, how can we give spotlights in different parts, maybe within India that need their foreign direct investment coming in, or having a look at Indian capital, the PSUs, to look at the markets in which our communities call home and utilize those bridges. Not only does it expand upon trade and influence, but more importantly, real job creation. So that's something that we're now looking into. And we're also going to be expanding our membership program. So now all of a sudden, whether you're sitting in Malaysia or you're sitting in Delhi, or you're sitting in Pondicherry, or you're sitting in Lilongwe, you can now be part of a network that has your voice, your ideas, and your understanding about the world united. One thing that we have made a direct thing with is that we're going to be non-political and non-religious, because as a civilization, as a community that is so vast, that came from the same ancestral lands, the lands that taught us about humanity, that taught us about spiritualism, that taught us about oneness. Well, the biggest service we can do then is connect these dots on a global scale for the benefit of everybody. So that's something else that we're looking to now institutionalize. The last thing that you said is India's narrative. I agree with you. I think there's sometimes a misperception within India, almost drinking the Kool-Aid. They think that the world likes you and the world thinks that you're great. And the fact that you can do an AI summit and the world comes over. Look, if you offer contracts within the world's largest emerging market, and foreign companies will come because they're coming not because of friendship, they're coming because they want the economic business. India needs to do a lot more when it comes to its global narrative. And there's a lot of pain points right there. And if they don't do enough, it is going to come back and be an absolute pain in the bum. Where we stand on that is that we're at the forefront. There's been many organizations that have copied our name that have come and they've gone. And I know there's many more that have come from within India thinking, what a great idea, but they haven't got the exposure, they haven't got the experience, they haven't got the credibility, and also they don't have the trust of the community. Things that I've been awarded because it's been 20 years of doing this and traveling to over 75 countries, being held hostage through to hurricanes and the whole works. So we're in a very unique space. India's narrative can be shifted in a very positive way if it just does the basic things well and it works alongside, if it's not organizations like ours, even other organizations who I don't know exist, but people that can do what we do. Because then what it allows them to do is have a seat at the table by creating a real unified version saying, this is what it means to be us. Right now, Arun, you know it as well as I. Back in the 80s and 90s, India's idea was because of Indiana Jones. We ate monkey brains and eyeballs. Then it came down to the Slumdog Millionaire idea. And that made a pain in my bum for many years, right? So anytime I went somewhere, that's what came. Stories define how a nation is seen. The media landscape constantly reinforces how a nation is seen. We're seeing a huge anti Indian, not Indian national, but all of us as a diaspora, a huge anti Indian movement across the globe. Marches, things that happen in Ireland, through to what the diaspora are facing in the UK, through to indigenous laws in Malawi. It is happening to all of us, not one of us, but the entire ecosystem. You kind of think then that this is a time now that we unitedly come together. And India can benefit immensely from that because not only does it create trust within the community, not only does it create familiarity, but then that trust and familiarity exposes itself to credible conversations that then turn itself into economic diplomacy and public diplomacy. You only know who your friends are when times are tough, don't you?
So thank you, Rajan. I'll end this conversation, though this quote was said in a different context, but I'll put it in this context that in the field of information warfare, so if don't have a seat on the table, then you are on the menu. So,
Yeah, it's absolutely true.
yeah.
And like I just want to say thank you for
Yeah.
inviting me onto your platform. I think what you've been able to achieve with your discourses with international players is absolutely remarkable. And that's where the media landscape needs to be moving into as well. As India, you need to be a lot more outward at times. And as a global Indian community, which is all of us guys, we need to then start connecting the dots in a more secure fashion.
So thank you, Rajan, for being on the show. It's such a wonderful, enlightening conversation, and we hope to host you back soon on the show, and we'll keep on troubling you. And because your thoughts, basically, uh, they're not those typical. There are no more cliches. There's no more. The textbook rhetoric, which generally we are used to when, especially talking about the global Indian community. So it's like a whiff of fresh air. We would like to have more of this fresh air. So and thank you viewers for watching, and we'll be back soon with another conversation. Thank you, Rajan, once again. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.